All right, welcome to the last video in our module looking at animal diversity. In this video, we're going to cover the last two phyla of animals, and that's going to be the echinoderms and the chordates. This phylum, or these phyla, make up the group, the deuterostomes. And if you remember in our discussion in the previous video, deuterostomes have the developmental pathway where the blastospore turns into the anus and then the digestive system completes during the development. Whereas protostomes, that blastospore will turn into the mouth. And so these two phyla are going to make up the deuterostomes. Okay, so we finished with the protostomes. Now we're getting into the deuterostomes. And the first phylum of the deuterostomes is Echinodermata, and this makes up all of the echinoderms. The echinoderms are named this because they have spiny surfaces. So you can think of like sea urchins, sea stars have little spines on them. Those are your echinoderms. The echinoderms don't have body segments. That segmentation is not kind of present. They have radial symmetry as adults, so they've re-evolved radial symmetry, but they're in the bilateral grouping of organisms, of animals, because their larval stage is bilaterally symmetrical. So this is a unique evolutionary trait that we don't see in other animals, and that's kind of the re-evolution of that radial symmetry. Echinoderms have an endoskeleton, but they don't have a skeletal system like vertebrates. Their interior skeleton is made up of hard plates that are just underneath the surface of the skin. And for example, if you've ever found a sand dollar on the beach, that is the endoskeleton of the sand dollar. They have tissue that surrounds that, and so you basically found the skeleton of a sand dollar. And a sand dollar is in the echinoderm phyla. The echinoderms are all marine organisms, and they all have this really interesting water vascular system. A water vascular system you can think of as like hydraulic pumps, and it's basically a network of canals that have water that circulates through those canals, and it allows for gas exchange. It allows for them to get rid of waste. And for example, in sea urchins and sea stars, it moves their tube feet, and so that water is pumped through, and it's kind of how they move their tube feet, which allows them to move across the surface of their environment. So hydrovascular system is very important for echinoderms. So here are some figures of echinoderms. This is a sand dollar. You can see the tissue on it. If you've bought a sand dollar as a souvenir from like a beach shop, or you found it on the beach, it would be white, right? And then that white hard part is the endoskeleton that you found. You have a sea urchin, you have lots of sea stars, different types of species here. And this is actually showing the tube feet of the sea star. You can see those little white feet that are stuck to what looks like a bivalve. And then here on the sea urchin, in between their spikes, they have tube feet that that kind of stretch out, that allow them to move across the ground. And then you have a sea cucumber here, which is also in the phylum Echinodermata. All right, and so echinoderms are a sister phyla to chordates. And chordates is the phylum that all the vertebrates are found in. And if you look at the embryonic development of chordates and echinoderms, that's basically what kind of differentiates that grouping. or I should say it differentiates echinoderms and chordates from all of the other animals. And that's that deuterostome and protostome development that we talked about in earlier videos. And so now we're going to move on to our last phylum, and that's the Chordata, the chordate phylum. And the chordates are made up of all the vertebrates in the animal kingdom, and that includes us, that includes humans. All vertebrates have endoskeletons. Endoskeletons are a shared characteristic with echinoderms. It's just that our endoskeletons in chordates are unique because we have a vertebra, so a backbone, a skull, and that is where the group's name basically comes from. Is the vertebra and the vertebrae that is found within the group. And so here is the vertebrae of an endoskeleton. We have a snake here, and you can see all of the repeating vertebral elements that is found within the endoskeleton of the snake. Now, chordates have 4 specific characteristics. Any organism that you look at that is in the chordate phylum will have these 4 characteristics at some point in their lifetime. They'll either have all of them as an embryo and then lose some as they develop into other structures, or they'll have some as an embryo and some as an adult. And these 4 characteristics are the dorsal hollow nerve cord, the notochord, pharyngeal gill slits, and a post-anal tail. Okay. And like I said, you'll find all of these in each organism in the Chordata phylum. Now, chordates have a type of body segmentation that is very apparent whenever you look at the backbone of the vertebrates. And there are also segmented muscles that exist in the chordates. And so you have this kind of specialized segmentation that is now evolved in the vertebrate or the chordata group. So here you have a primitive chordate, so a basal chordate. This is a lancelet, an image of a lancelet. You have the dorsal hollow nerve cord, which represents the nerve system. You have the post-anal tail, pharyngeal gill slits, and you have the notochord itself. Okay, and the notochord is what will develop into the vertebral column. There are 2 groups of chordates that are actually invertebrates, but all of the other chordates are, the 2 groups are invertebrates. All of the other chordates consist of all of the vertebrates that exist. The 2 groups that are invertebrates are the tunicates and the lancelets. And this is a simplified image of a lancelet. I believe we have another image here. So the image on the left are lancelets. They kind of bury themselves in the sand where they have a mouth, they have a tail, and then the post-anal, the pharyngeal gill slits, the notochord, dorsal hollow nerve cord. Tunicates look like this. They have some characteristics of chordates as an embryo and then some as an adult. Okay. And so these are 2 kind of subgroupings of the chordates. I believe it's like Urochordata and Cephalochordata are those 2 groups. And then you have the Verbrata, which are the vertebrates. Okay. And so here we have a look at the phylogenetic tree of vertebrates, of chordates, and basically where big major characteristics evolved in the chordate group. So we have your 2 basal groups of the chordates, the tunicates and the lancelets, and then everything below them as we see from this node here, has evolved a vertebral column. So hagfishes all the way to mammals have a vertebral column. Now, the hagfishes and the lampreys are what we refer to as the jawless fishes, jawless organisms. And jaws only evolved after that grouping. So from cartilaginous fishes to mammals. Okay? Cartilaginous fishes do not have a bony endoskeleton. They are completely made up of cartilage. The only bone in their body is their teeth. After that, you have bony fishes. Then you have the development of legs. So after the bony fishes, you have legs to evolve. Then you get your amphibians. And then from amphibians, you have the development of the amniotic egg. So eggs that contain a shell and an amnion that allow organisms to move away from water. Everything from amphibians and down all lived in water or relied on water for reproduction, like your amphibians. But reptiles and mammals don't rely on that water for reproduction because they have the amniotic egg that prevents the embryo from drying out. Okay. So the first group we're going to really look at are the fishes. The first vertebrates, like we mentioned, were aquatic. We think they evolved during the Cambrian period, so that period around 540 or so million years ago. And these first early fishes were jawless fishes, so they didn't have any jaws. And the current modern day representation of these jawless fishes are hagfishes and lampreys. Okay, hagfishes are more scavengers, so they scavenge the seafloor for dead and decaying organisms, and they live in the dark parts of the ocean, dark, deep parts of the ocean. And then you have the lampreys, which are parasites. They have these little suckers that they attach to large fishes with and kind of ride on them, and then they get their nutrients that way. There are two groups of fishes that actually have jaws. These are the cartilaginous fishes and the bony fishes. Like we mentioned, the cartilaginous fishes have a flexible skeleton, but it's made of cartilage. The only bone that some cartilaginous fishes have are the teeth, like you find in sharks. Cartilaginous fishes, which are the chondrichthyes, are the sharks, skates, and rays. And then you have your bony fishes, and then your bony fishes have a skeleton that has the vertebral column, the ribs, etc., reinforced by calcium, very different from that cartilaginous skeleton. Now, your bony fishes can be subdivided into two different groups. You have your ray fin fishes and your lobe fin fishes. The ray fin fishes are examples of those are like your tuna and your trout, and they have the fins that have the hard bony rays that go through those fins, and that's why they're called or referred to as ray fin fishes. Now, your lobe fin fishes, examples of these are lungfishes and the coelacanth. The coelacanth actually was thought to be extinct until about a decade or 2 decades ago. Somebody was diving off of the coast of Africa and happened to find a coelacanth. And so we now know that coelacanths are alive and well, and they still exist. And so they are an example of lobe fin fishes. Lobe fin fishes have a fin that is actually kind of rounded and has a lobe-like structure to it. And I thought we had an image here. We don't. And so basically, we think that lobe fin fishes, very good evidence. We don't think, we have very good evidence that lobe fin fishes are the precursors to terrestrial organisms. And so lobe-fin fishes actually have a somewhat larger pectoral girdle, and they could actually put weight on their lobe fins, and they could use them to kind of walk across the ocean floor. And there are lobe fin fishes today that can go out of water and use their fins to kind of move across the terrestrial environment to get to other water areas. So, for example, if a watering hole is drying up, that lobe fin fish can go out of the water and search for another water source that is not drying up. What's interesting with lobe fin fishes as well is they also have what's called a pseudo lung. So this pseudo lung allows them to take in oxygen from the atmosphere and to make use of it a little bit. And so, for example, you may have seen like a catfish it go up to the surface of the water, and it looks like it's kind of gulping for air, and it actually is. And so when oxygen concentrations will get low in a river or a pond, the lobe fin fishes can go up and gulp for air and use air from the atmosphere while the water has low oxygen concentrations. So here we have some images of those different groups. So we have the hagfishes, we have the lamprey, and you can see the sucker attachment portion of that lamprey. You have your cartilaginous fishes. An example here is a shark. Then you have your bony fishes here, and this is a ray fin fish, and you can see the rays that are going through that fin, right? And so all of these fins have bony ray structures that go through the fin. Now, with the cartilaginous and the bony fishes, they have what's called a lateral line system, and that's also shown here. The lateral line is here in the bony fish, and it's here, goes down in the shark. And these lateral line systems allows for the fishes to detect little vibrations that exist in the water. Now, some different characteristics or traits that bony fishes have that aren't found in your cartilaginous fishes is that the bony fish contains what's called an operculum. This is a flap that covers their gills. And so whenever you see a fish and it's like, opening its mouth, and then you see the side of its face kind of open where the gills are, that flap that's opening and closing is a operculum, and it covers and protects the gills so that they don't get snagged or broken on anything, because they're kind of fragile structures. Now, they have like a hard raker that's called that the gill tissue is on, but if they get damaged, then they're not able to generate any oxygen out of their water, and so that could be very, very bad. So that operculum helps to protect the gills. And they also have a swim bladder, which is a structure that is filled with gas, and it helps them to stay buoyant in their aquatic environments. And now, like I mentioned earlier, we have evidence that suggests that these lobe fin fishes that could kind of use their fins to walk and maneuver around the bottom of the ocean and then eventually into the terrestrial environment were the precursors of the amphibians and the first terrestrial organisms. And this makes sense because amphibians also rely on that aquatic environment, but they do have terrestrial adaptations. And so while amphibians are tied to water because their eggs don't have shells, and so they have to lay their eggs in water so they don't dry out quickly, they metamorphose and leave that aquatic environment and turn into a terrestrial adult. So they have those two life stages, the aquatic and the terrestrial life stage, that really separates them from a lot of the other groups. So here you have, frog eggs. You can see the embryos growing, and again, they're in water. They've laid them on some type of vegetation to keep them in place. Here's a tadpole. That tadpole will metamorphose into whatever frog or or toad species it is. You have your adult tree frog here. You have a Malayan horned toad, and then you have salamanders. Salamanders are also a type of amphibian, and you can have small, tiny salamanders, and then there are some very large salamanders that exist as well. And so amphibians were, again, the first vertebrates to colonize the land. Like I mentioned, we believe they come from lungfishes, and terrestrial vertebrates, so amphibians, reptiles, and mammals, we refer to as tetrapods because they have 4 feet. So tetra, 4 pods, referring to the feet. And so the fossil record actually has a really good chronicle of the evolutionary changes from the early lungfish ancestors to early amphibian ancestors. And if you're really interested in looking at this, one of the early kind of more famous transitional species is referred to as tiktaalik. So tiktaalik. I would recommend looking that up if you're interested in, and they have characteristics of terrestrial, early amphibian and fish species. So it's a really interesting transitional fossil. And this is kind of what the Tiktaalik resembled, is this early amphibian ancestor here. Here's a lobe fin fish. You can see those lobe fins. They have, like I mentioned, a larger pelvic girdle, which allows them to kind of put weight on those front lobe fins. And then eventually, over time, they transition to where those pectoral girdles get larger and stronger and allow them to move to that more terrestrial environment where weight-bearing structures are necessary. All right, so the next group we're going to look at is the reptiles, or are the reptiles. All right, so the group of reptiles includes organisms like snakes, lizards, turtles, alligators, crocodiles, and birds. Yes, birds are a reptile. Birds actually descended from dinosaurs, and a number of extinct groups, including the dinosaurs, also fall into the reptile grouping. Reptiles have 2 key adaptations that allow them to live on land in the terrestrial environment. One is that they have this waterproof skin. This waterproof skin is very important because it prevents them from dehydrating. The second big thing is that reptiles, including birds and mammals, are referred to as amniotes. And amniotes produce what's known as amniotic eggs. Amniotic eggs are these unique adaptations that are only found in reptiles, birds, and they are eggs that have a shell, like you think of a chicken egg, right? It has a shell. That shell is waterproof. It prevents the embryo from drying out, and it also protects that developing embryo. So now, since you have this waterproof covering that surrounds the egg, you don't have to worry about your embryo drying out. So now these organisms aren't tied to ponds, rivers, or lakes. And so we see this movement from the aquatic environment to the terrestrial non-aquatic ecosystems. And so this amniotic egg is basically their self-contained pond that allows those amniotes to complete their life cycles on the land. And so the amniotic egg is named so because there's an amnion inside the egg, right? So the egg has this protective shell. This shell has an albumin, which is referred to as the egg white. Then it has the developing embryo inside an amnion. And then there is a yolk that provides the nutrients for that developing embryo. And so all of these here are examples of reptiles that have amniotic eggs and lay amniotic eggs, right? So all reptiles lay those eggs. And so that's lizards, crocodiles, snakes, dinosaurs, and birds, right? And the non-bird reptiles are what we refer to as cold-blooded or ectotherms, meaning that they regulate their internal body temperature by using the heat from the environment, so external heat. So they don't control their body temperature through metabolism like mammals do, for example. And so these non-birded reptiles like lizards and snakes will bask in the sun or go in the shade to heat and cool their body. So they use that solar energy to help them break down food. And because they don't use the metabolic energy to break down food, then that means they can survive on less food because they don't require as many calories, because a lot of the calories that we need go to maintaining that internal body temperature, that state of homeostasis. So a non-bird reptile that is the same size as a mammal can survive on less than 10% of the required calories needed. During the evolutionary history of reptiles, they were much more widespread and diverse, so many more species than what are still around today. Unfortunately, a lot of those species went extinct at the end of the Mesozoic era. So the end of the Cretaceous period, so the KT extinction event, is when a lot of those reptiles died off and went extinct. This was about 70 million years ago. And what that did is it opened up a lot of kind of niches and resources for other animals to take advantage of. And the only real lineage that remains from dinosaurs today are the birds. And so birds, we believe, based off of fossil evidence, that they evolved from the lineage of dinosaurs known as the theropods. So basically the smaller raptor-like dinosaurs. We now know had feathers like Archaeopteryx, Microraptor. Those individuals were feathered dinosaurs. And what's really cool is researchers have been able to extract pigments out of fossils, and we can determine what color some of these feathers were. So we now have an idea of what some of the coloration patterns were in some of these extinct dinosaur species, which is pretty neat. And so here's a geologic timescale figure where it shows. So here you have the diversification of bony fishes. You also have those lobe fin fishes going into the terrestrial habitats. You have the diversification of dinosaurs in the end of the Cretaceous period, the end of the Mesozoic era, which is when those dinosaurs went extinct. And again, that extinction from the dinosaurs allowed for a lot of these resources to now be available. Whereas reptiles were kind of dominating those habitats, the early mammal species were small, probably burrowing or arboreal species that were nocturnal. They were probably very secretive, hid from the dinosaurs, because a lot of the dinosaurs were carnivorous and didn't want to be eaten by those carnivorous dinosaurs, right? And so first, before we kind of get into the mammals, we want to finish up with reptiles and talk about birds, right? So we said that birds stem and came and evolved off of a lineage of dinosaurs that walked on two legs that were small, and those are referred to as theropods. Birds have a lot of unique adaptations that led to the ability to fly and to have that enhanced flight. One of those is having, hollow bones, these honeycomb bone structures. They also have only one ovary instead of two. They have a lack of teeth, and so this kind of minimizes weight. That also allows the birds to fly. And birds are endotherms, whereas the other reptile species are ectotherms. So birds use their own metabolic heat to maintain their constant body temperature. Birds also have wing structures that are airfoils, and they basically have the same aerodynamics as airplane wings. So, when they constructed and engineered airplane wings, the wings of birds was one of the things they looked at and kind of what they structured those airplane wings off of. What birds also have is a very large breast muscle that's anchored to an enlarged breastbone. And so this enlarged breastbone is basically the shape of a keel. So the keel of a boat, it's flat and it allows you to kind of steer the boat. And what that does is it has an increased surface area for more muscle attachment. So if you have more muscle, you can get stronger wing flaps to allow you to fly. And birds also have feathers. And so like I mentioned, the early theropods we now know were feathered. And feathers are made up of the same protein that forms the scales of reptiles. And so these feathers are just modified reptile scales that has formed a different function, right? And early on, we think feathers weren't evolved for flight. We believe that they would have served to insulate, to help retain body heat, for courtship displays, for behavioral adaptations. And later on, as some of the earlier theropods began, or the later theropods began to kind of jump and glide, they became adapted as flight gear. So they became adapted as flight feathers. Okay. And so that's kind of an overview of the reptile group, right? So the early kind of first vertebrate group. Now we're going to look at mammals. And mammals, we think evolved from, a reptilian-like ancestor. And there are two lineages of amniotes. The first lineage are the reptiles, and then the second led to mammals. And so that early common ancestor is why I said it was reptile-like, right? The first mammals evolved about 200 million years ago. And like I mentioned, they were small, nocturnal, probably burrowed or lived in trees, so they were arboreal. And after the dinosaurs went extinct and all those niches and resources became available, then you see the diversification of mammals, right? Then you get herbivorous mammals and carnivore mammals, whereas the dinosaurs kind of occupied that space before they went extinct. And now mammals have two unique characteristics to their group. The first is mammary glands. These mammary glands produce milk, which is nutrient rich, and depending on the species, the milk can have more or less fat. So for example, seals that live in cold environments have a very high fat content milk that allows their young to grow really fast and to put on a lot of fat so that they can stay warm in those cold environments. Whereas if you're a mammal that lives in a hot environment, your milk is not going to be as rich in fats, because they don't need to put on as much weight as quickly. Mammals also have hair that helps to insulate the body. They can have a lot of hair and be fully covered, like we think about with dogs and most mammals, or we can have very little hair, like with humans. Now, mammals themselves can be grouped into three major categories, or to three big groups. The first is a category where we actually have egg-laying mammals, right? This is like your platypus and your echidnas that lay eggs, right? These are referred to as monotremes. Then you have marsupials, which are almost like an intermediate stage where they have pouches with a placenta, and the placenta basically consists of embryonic and maternal tissues. And it joins the embryo to the mother within the uterus, right? And so the placenta is what gives the embryo its oxygen and nutrients. And then the embryo is kind of developing in this pouch, right, that has that placenta. Now, for eutherians, right, or these true mammals or true placental mammals, they carry their placentas that are internal, and the embryo has a much longer kind of developmental association with the mother compared to the other two groups of the mammals. Right? So here we have a duck-billed platypus, right, that has its offspring that had hatched from an egg. You have a kangaroo, which is the marsupial. So they're embryonic at birth. They grow and develop in that pouch. And then you have a fully developed organism in eutherians that develop completely internal within their mother. And whenever they're born, they're fully developed, which is different from marsupials, which develop inside the pouch, which contains the placenta. Now, looking at mammals and kind of the human ancestry, so the evolution of primates. So primates are the mammalian group in which we are found in. So Homo sapiens, humans, are in the primate group. And primates evolved about 65 million years ago from those early insect-eating mammals. The early primates were small, arboreal species that lived in trees, and they then modified or became modified through evolution, and different characteristics were selected for that allowed them to live in the trees much more efficiently. So you have longer appendages, you have more dexterous fingers, you have prehensile tails that allow them to make use of that arboreal environment. The fossil record indicates that humans and chimps shared a common ancestor in Africa that diverged about 6 to 7 million years ago. Okay? One of the big misconceptions with this idea of evolution and chimps and humans sharing a common ancestor is that if chimpanzees were our ancestor, then why do they still exist? Okay, so here's the big reason this misconception exists is basically because a lot of the public doesn't really understand how evolution works. Evolution is a population level process. It does not work on a single individual. And evolution is the change of alleles in a population over time. And that change in alleles leads to changes in the genetic diversity, which causes other physical traits to manifest and to become more common in a population. Okay. So you can have one population that is the chimpanzees. And let's say some individuals of those chimpanzees stop living in trees, and they don't always live in trees, right? Maybe they live in a tree part of the time and then they go get resources from the ground. But they have a hard time kind of hopping on the ground because they're not really fully bipedal, right? Chimps can walk on their back legs, but they don't do so efficiently. But maybe there's an individual that can walk a little bit better than the other chimps because its bone structure is a little different. Now, that individual is more successful on the ground, so it has a higher survival rate, and so it passes its traits on to its offspring. Then its offspring are more successful, and so they have a higher survival rate compared to the others. So they reproduce more often. So over time, you can see how they will become more prominent and common in the population. And so now you have a population that can walk a little bit more efficiently as a bipedal organism. And then maybe another trait appears. Maybe it's dexterous thumbs, or it's a larger brain, or it's walking completely upright all the time. And that trait, those traits continue to evolve and manifest over time. Meanwhile, you still have chimpanzees living in the trees, and those chimps are evolving in their own direction, right? And so over millions of years, you've had these culmination of traits to evolve that led to Homo sapiens like we see them today, right? It wasn't just this sudden split from a chimpanzee turning into a human, right? That evolution image that you see on like posters and shirts where it's, you know, a chimpanzee walking across the ground and all of a sudden it's upright and then more upright and then you have a human. That's not the way evolution works. And that's one of the reasons that misconception exists, and that figure is not accurate, right? That figure does not show how evolution actually happens. And so evolution is not this ladder series of steps leading directly to Homo sapiens, right, from chimpanzees. It is basically this progressive step of intermediate phases between our chimpanzee-like ancestor and our ancestor that led to Homo sapiens. So there were times throughout the hominid history, early humans, where several human species actually coexisted at the same time. And so instead of it being this ladder-like structure, it's actually this multi-branching structure, right? So all of these fossils here are human-like species, from Australopithecus to Homo habilis to Homo erectus to Paranthropus to these little hobbit-like human species that were found out in the Florensis Island. And so there are lots and lots of, you know, intermediate phases that led from chimpanzees to Homo sapiens. It's not this ladder-like structure that existed, and that is a common misconception that occurs. But looking at the past 100,000 years, humans really haven't changed that much. We've wandered across the globe, and we've colonized much of the globe over, or all of the globe, right, over those 100,000 years, and settled in diverse habitats. And human populations have encountered selective forces, but there's not much changed in terms of phenotypic traits and drastic evolutionary changes. Human populations do have adaptations for those different environments, though. So, for example, populations in Africa have a higher frequency of the sickle cell hemoglobin because sickle cell is actually good at protecting against the disease malaria. So if you're a carrier for sickle cell, you have both normal blood cells and abnormal blood cells, but you don't have any of the sickle cell disease traits. But you're better adapted to deal with malaria than you are somebody who doesn't have the sickle cell trait, that you're not carrying it, right? And so populations that are in the malaria-prone environments have a higher incidence of sickle cell carriers than do, say, populations in the U.S. because we aren't exposed to malaria as often. And also populations that are, you know, early on, whenever domestication started, that lived mainly with dairy herds, actually have the ability to digest lactose as adults because they have a lot of dairy in their diets. And so those populations have adapted to have a higher case of lactase, which allows them to digest lactose. One of the more striking changes in cultures is the difference in skin color. And that, we think, comes from the fact that UV radiation hits the Earth at different strengths depending on your latitude. And so people that lived in Africa, populations that lived in Africa, have to deal with a lot of UV radiation. So the darker skin tones help with that UV radiation. However, when you get into higher latitudes, the radiation isn't as strong and it's not as perpendicular to the Earth's surface. So those populations didn't have to deal with intense UV radiation. And so their skin tones tend to get lighter as you go from the equator, which is around Africa, South America, a lot of the Pacific Islands, where you tend to see darker skin tones. And then as you go up in latitude, where the UV radiation is not as strong, you get lighter skin tones in those cultures. And so that UV radiation tends to select for specific skin tones around the globe. And also, finally, recent research has shown that there are other examples of adaptations that have allowed to us to colonize these very extreme environments. So, for example, the Andes Mountains in South America have populations of people that are living up around 12,000 feet. Air at 12,000 feet has 40% less oxygen. So you can imagine it's probably hard to breathe at those higher altitudes. However, those populations have adaptations that allow their hemoglobin to bind to more oxygen much more efficiently than people and populations that live at lower elevations. They also have a more viscous blood that means that they have more red blood cells, so they get more oxygen to their organs. And so they have genes that have been identified that have allowed or led to those evolutionary changes to occur in response to those low oxygen environments. And so this is just an image of a family from an Andean population that has dealt with or has adaptations to deal with those low oxygen environments. And so that's it for this video. And so that takes us through the tour of animal diversity. So we talked about the evolution of animals, what we think early animal ancestors looked like. We talked about the diversity of animals going from the basal animal groups, the ones with no tissue, no symmetry, which are the sponges, to the cnidarians, which are two tissues, radial symmetry. Then we went into the bilaterally symmetrical animals that have different developmental patterns, like your protostomes and your deuterostomes. We separated the deuterostomes into its two groups, where they grow either by ecdysis or through increasing their body mass in several stages. And that was your lophotrochozoans and your ecdysozoans. And then we finished up talking about the deuterostomes, which contained your echinoderms and your chordates, and your chordates are your vertebrates, right? And so that pretty much does it for our overview of the diversity on Earth. So we've went over animals, talked about plants, and we've talked about microbes. And so that does it for this video and this module, and we'll see you in the next module.